Hi, everybody. I'm going to go over some nomenclature intro so that we're a little bit more prepared for when we start talking about nomenclature tomorrow. Nomenclature is kind of a necessary evil in organic chemistry, but we're going to try to keep it as light as possible. This is definitely a topic that you can dive into really deep. We are not going to be doing that. We are going to be focusing on a very practical application of nomenclature so that it is easier for us to all talk to each other. Okay, that is the main goal here, is that we want to be able to talk about organic chemistry with the right words, and so that we're all on the same page. We're not trying to be like, oh yeah, the carbon on the left, that's kind of near the top. We want to be able to give specific words to tell each other what exactly we're talking about in the molecule. So part of that is, for our goals, we're going to be learning names of key functional groups. We'll be talking about what those functional groups are tomorrow in class on Tuesday. And then we'll also be learning structural fragments, so that you can kind of say, hey, look at that ethyl group, and everybody knows what you're talking about. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about in class. Our goal at the end of the day is to be able to draw a structure given a compound name. It's a lot harder to go the opposite direction, where you're given a compound and then have to come up with the name yourself. That is obnoxious, and there's a lot of different rules and regulations that organic chemists have decided on. It's not super important to be able to do that. You can kind of do you'll be able to do rough bits of that once you get through the other direction, being able to draw a structure with the name. But we're not going to get into that business of trying to name molecules. It is a pain in the butt, so we're not going to do that. So the other thing we want to be able to do is identify whether a certain atom is primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary. So we will talk a little bit about what those terms mean. It's important to note that the way that we write them down is with the number and the degree sign, but you don't say first degree, you will say primary, okay? So there is a distinction there. It looks like there's a degree sign, don't say degree. That is not how. If you do that, an organic chemist is going to be like, what? I'm not sure what you're talking about. So we want to make sure that we're using all the right words. And this is really like learning a language, so it's going to take some time. This is a part of the class that flashcards will actually be really helpful as you're trying to learn those functional groups and fragments. Okay, so we're going to focus on this bullet point in this video. We will talk more about these in class. So if you want to look at functional groups, there are some stuff in your book about it. And we will do some practice about drawing structures given a compound name. Okay, so first off, let's talk about carbon. So that's going to be the first one we talk about in terms of primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary. So when we're trying to name what a carbon is in those terms, there we go. So if we try to name a carbon, we're really looking at how many carbons is the carbon that you want to know about attached to. Okay, so it really comes down to, if you have a structure, we'll just do this one. So if I'm looking at this carbon, we know that that's a CH3. So we have 3 H's there. That carbon is attached to one other carbon. That is primary. Okay, that's a primary carbon. If I look at this one, that carbon is attached to 2 other carbons. That's going to be secondary. Okay, if I'm looking at that carbon, I have no protons on that. I have 4 bonds to other carbons. That's our quaternary carbon. Okay, carbon with 4 other carbon atoms on it. If I'm looking at this one, I have 1 H over here to make my total of 4 bonds. That means I have 3 bonds to other carbons, so that is a tertiary. Okay, so it's important that we are proficient at identifying these things. because this will have serious impacts in terms of reactivity, particularly with the reactions that we're going to start with. So it is really important that we think about what exactly we have going on in these molecules. And this is how we are going to communicate it. There we go. Okay, so that's how we do carbons. For hydrogens, okay, so hydrogens, alkyl halides, which are going to be kind of abbreviated RX, and alcohols are all going to be done the exact same way. Okay, so it's pretty nice. Like you can essentially break everything down that we want to talk about into 3 different groups or categories in terms of how exactly we're going to be assigning the primary, secondary nomenclature. So for hydrogens, alkyl halides, so remember that's anything like fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. Those are going to be the main ones that we see on a carbon. And alcohols, they are all going to be done the same way. And the way we do that is we count how many carbons are attached to the carbon bearing the atom in question. So remember, the atom in question is going to be H, X, or OH. Okay, so if I take an example of that, if we have this structure, so we know that we have CH3, 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 there's an H there, there's 2 H's there. Okay, so if I'm looking to identify what hydrogens I have around, so my primary ones, those are all going to be, we're looking at these H's, it's how many carbons is this carbon attached to, and the answer is 1. Okay, so then all of these H's are primary. All of those are primary because we have a carbon, all those H's are on 1 carbon that is attached to 1 carbon. Okay, so for this H, so that hydrogen is on this carbon, which is attached to 3 other carbons. So this one is tertiary. Okay, and then we have those ones, those H's are attached to that carbon, which is attached to 2 other carbons. So that is secondary. Okay, so if I take another example, let's look at something like this. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing with alkyl halides or alcohols. I meant to make that black. Okay, so if I take this OH, so it is on this carbon, that carbon is attached to 3 other carbons. So this is a tertiary alcohol. Okay, if we look at this chlorine, it's actually in a very similar position. It's attached to this carbon, which is attached to 3 other carbons. That is a tertiary alkyl chloride. Okay, and remember halogens, halides, that's the fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine column. Okay, so if I look at this bromine, remember I have an H right here. So that bromine is attached to this carbon, which is attached to 2 other carbons. So this is a secondary alkyl bromide. Okay, And then if I look at this OH, it's on this carbon. That carbon is attached to one other carbon. This is a primary alcohol. Okay. So that whole span covers 3 different types, which is really nice. You can kind of lump them together. The final one that we want to learn about and get comfortable with are amines. Okay, and amines are actually really straightforward. So it's literally just how many carbons are attached to the nitrogen. Okay, so if I have something that looks like this, okay, so if I have this nitrogen is attached to 1, 2, 3 carbons. That is a tertiary amine. Okay, this nitrogen is attached to 2 carbons. Secondary amine. This nitrogen attached to 1 carbon. Primary amine. Okay, so the amines are definitely pretty easy, but you can kind of break it down into those 3 different categories. Whichever one you follow, just make sure that you know what the process is. But at least there's only 3 things. So definitely this is something that's going to take some practice. We're going to have to work at this. But like I said, it's going to be really important when we start talking about reactions to be able to identify what kinds of primary, secondary, tertiary items that we're dealing with. So make sure that you practice this. We will be using this information later on, and it will be so much easier if we're all really comfortable with it. So hopefully this was helpful. We will talk about nomenclature tomorrow, and have a good one. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you all later.